Welcome everyone. I'll give everyone just a few more moments here until we get started. Looks like people are trickling in. Okay, before we start with the actual presentation with Brenda Salmon and with Mark, I would just like to briefly go over some housekeeping for today's webinar. This is a meeting, and which means that you are more than welcome to unmute yourself and speak. Or raise your hand, or if you would like to ask your question in chat, you're more than welcome to do so. This webinar is recorded, and hopefully the recording will be up as soon as this evening on our website. If you do need to add closed captions, that will be on the bottom toolbar of Zoom. And without any further ado, I would like to hand this off to Mark.
And I think it was in August, or then all right. Well, good afternoon, and I think it's good afternoon all across the country. It should be noon over there in Pacific time. And welcome to the AACRAO webinar on the state of digital credentials in the AACRAO community. I'll give more explanation on that in a moment. But first of all, I am just so privileged and honored to have Brenda Salmon basically do this webinar with me. I'm just so pleased. Let me take a few minutes and have Brenda introduce themselves to you.
Multitasking.
And Wilfredo, if you could, I think it's well, somebody was unmuted. So
there we go.
There we go.
We're good. I'm Brenda Salmon, Assistant Vice Provost for Enrollment Management and the University Registrar here at the University of Missouri, also known as Mizzou. I also am serving as the Vice President for Admissions and Enrollment Management for AACRAO, and so I'm very pleased to be a part of today's webinar and discussion with Mark. So take it away.
And I am Mark McConaughey. I'm I work part-time for AACRAO as the Digital Credential Coordinator, and sometimes I also serve as a Senior Consultant. Before that, I worked at Indiana University for almost 40 years. In the last 13 or so, I was the Associate Vice Provost and Registrar at Indiana University in Bloomington. I retired about a couple of years ago, and as a result of some of the work I did both for AACRAO associated with the comprehensive learner record work that was happening in the late teens, and because some of the work I had done at Indiana University, there was an opportunity to do some work with AACRAO directly on digital credentials, and thus I find myself here. Now, you know, of course, most of you are still active in your working lives. You know, I am within the last 2 years recently retired, and I would say it's really been great so far, but I will confess that I've had a few issues, and thankfully to all my colleagues at AACRAO, I really have worked my way through it. As it turns out, you know, it's hard to admit this, but you know, it turns out that I was addicted to brake fluid. And you know, thanks to Brenda and all the other people, I figured out and realized that I could stop anytime. And I know you're rolling your eyes, maybe chuckling, maybe groaning. I can't tell because it's a webinar, but nevertheless, you know, that gets us going. Also, and just because I have to do this, I've been doing it for years and explaining that I am the Brad Pitt of registrars. And this, of course, is a webinar about digital credentials. I explained that I am the Brad Pitt of registrars. Should be obvious to all of you, just as you look at me in the small little portion at the top right of your screen, doppelganger and all that. But I also need to point out that it is a self-assertion. You know, AACRAO has not asserted that I look like Brad Pitt, nor am I the Brad Pitt of registrars, nor is the state of Indiana, where I'm located. They have also not said that I am Brad Pitt. So that is a self-assertion as opposed to a verified credential, a verified identity coming from an institution, which is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. So what are we doing today? This webinar is really about the results of a survey that we did in June. The reason for the survey was really to determine what is the state of alternative digital credentials throughout the AACRAO membership. What do they understand? How much implementation has there been? What are the chief issues? What kinds of things can we learn from the membership about the state of these kinds of credentials? I will also say that this is the result of part of the reason that we were able to do this is that we received a grant from the Walmart Foundation. And part of that grant was to really gauge where we stood as an association, as members, as higher education in terms of alternative and digital credentials. So therefore, that's exactly what we're doing. It should be clear to everybody that AACRAO is just such a key constituent. And of course, we're going to be continuing this work. So what were the responses? Actually, we were hoping for a little better response, but actually it wasn't too bad. 318 responses. I need to explain the 232 responses only in that several of the questions were open-ended. And as a result of being open-ended, if people didn't feel comfortable in responding to those particular questions, it ended up not being a complete response. But otherwise, you know, we had a pretty good sample size. Is it a good random sample? No, I don't want to go too far into it. And but as you can see, no, it really wasn't. We can't guarantee that it was a random sample size. One of the things I will say, though, is if you look at the top two reporting line of the respondents, you can see that it's academic affairs, enrollment management. Primarily, registrars and admission folks were the primary responders here based on that. And based on that assumption, it could also have been in the chief executive component. So we're pretty sure we're hitting the right demographic within this particular survey. So what were the overall conclusions? And you know, it's easy to talk about conclusions of various kinds. This will be a survey, there'll be statistics. And I'm often reminded that statistics are can mean many things. For example, I once read a statistic that 44% of all marriages end in divorce. Well, if you look at that as stark value, that sounds pretty dang high and kind of startling. But then you can turn that around. That also means that 56% of all marriages ended in death. I don't know. A completely different concept based upon the exact same statistics. So we recognize that. We put that into context. And as a matter of fact, as we talk about some of the conclusions and some of the things that we've derived from the survey, we recognize it's not conclusive, that statistics can be interpreted in many, many ways. Brenda and I are going to talk about at least some of the conclusions that we've reached as a result of perusing this data. But we invite you, just as we said at the beginning, to participate in the discussion. We don't have all the right answers. We do have some more information to bring to bear, and that information should be the fruit of even more discussion. So here we go. Some overall conclusions just to get us started, and then we'll go into some detail. Terms and definitions. Oh my gosh, this ended up being a big deal. And AACRAO, those of us who put together the survey, we are just as guilty. You know, there really is a lack of clear understanding about all the terms that are used in this digital credential space. You know, CLR, LER, you know, a comprehensive learner record, learner and employment record, a digital wallet, a badge, a micro-credential, an alternative credential. What do they mean? Are they interchangeable? One of the things that we kind of found as a result of the survey that is in many ways, in some ways, they were discussed as being interchangeable. In other ways, they were completely separated. So what do I mean by that? Well, and I do need to introduce a concept here. And it'll kind of weave through some of these discussions. And that is, what do we issue at higher ed institutions? We issue credentials. And how do we issue credentials? Those credentials represent things like degrees. We actually distribute those in the hands of those who need to see it in things like a diploma. That becomes a transport mechanism or a means by which we communicate the credential that has been bestowed upon an individual. And we do, so a diploma, what did we do with it? Well, we did all kinds of things with it, particularly in the old days. We embossed it, we put our signatures on it. We did all kinds of things to ensure that the receiver who looked at it viewed it as authentic. Now we do all kinds of things. And I don't want to get us down a sidetrack into all the things that we do to authenticate now digital records, but that's the idea. So there's the credential, and then what we hang it on in order to communicate it and transport it and distribute it and communicate it to an audience, whether that be the learner themselves or to somebody who's trying to basically review the credential and competency of the individual who has the credential. So those are the kinds of things that we looked at. And so when we look at this terms and definitions, where do those terms and definitions fit into those two concepts? So actually, and for that, I'm going to stop right there. And Brenda, did I explain that well? Do you agree with that outcome? And when you looked at this, what did you think?
Well, Mark, I think that's really an important part of it is that in talking with people around the country, I think there's a lot of confusion about exactly what the definitions are. And because this is something new, and we all understand what a credit hour is, and we've agreed for many years how many credit hours in a bachelor's degree, et cetera. So this is all new landscape, and it has shifted some over time. So I would agree. Some of you may remember we started out calling it the extended transcript, and we've called it some other things. So we've changed our definition as we've changed somewhat what's included as it's grown, but it also means that sometimes we're confusing things, and it makes it difficult a little bit then to get feedback as to where people are involved with it. So yes.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And actually, I'm spending a little more time on this than maybe it seems obvious why, but this winds its way all the way through this survey, this sort of distinction between what kind of digital credentials we're discussing and whether or not they're kind of serving as a credential or some other means of communication. So this just winds its way through. The second overall big thing, which quite frankly was a bit of a surprise to us because we thought we had to do a better job of this, although it's not huge, but registrars are absolutely necessary. And the vast preponderance, well, 2/3 of respondents believed that registrars were integral to the development and to the implementation and operation of the issuing of alternative credentials. Brenda?
I being of a registrar background, I agree. I know that some of my colleagues have not necessarily agreed with this, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But one of the challenges is that if registrars are not part of the early discussion and shaping this, they end up picking up the pieces later. And so I think that that's part of what this survey revealed was that one way or the other, registrars are going to be part of it.
And I do think that that's exactly right. And again, the whole idea of this idea that if it's a credential, then absolutely registrar should be involved. And at least 2/3 of the respondents already believe that to be the case. Piling on what Brenda said, the third big thing is that basically most of the respondents believe that digital credentials are going to happen, that they've been adopted, that they're happening at their institutions. I will say this is one of the things that goes back to number one, that bifurcation between CLRs, LERs, and digital mode of transport, wallets, and those things, is that if you just spoke about badges, digital micro credentials, and so forth, really there was a lot of adoption. If you talked about CLR, LER, and wallets, much less so. despite the fact that even though we made a big deal about that, there it really is a continuum between the two. By the way, this has received enough attention. This is not, I just, within the last couple of days, noted this, that HLC has basically started a whole group that's going to review the issuance of alternative credentials, digital credentials, and basically it is becoming part of the mainstream. Adoption is going to happen.
I want to chime in with one other thing. If you believe that this is not happening on your campus, I would encourage you to have some discussions with faculty and staff in areas maybe where you don't normally interact, because a lot of the software that enables individuals to produce a digital credential can be leveraged and used for free. And so whether or not your institution has adopted a policy or has engaged with you as the registrar, I think that what people are finding is that one way or the other, it's happening on your campus.
So moving on, and this is and I have several of these, so I apologize already, but this is a rather dense slide, but don't try to read the whole thing. Just know that on the upper right, that is basically the responses to is your campus knowledgeable, considering, implementing, developing CLRs, LERs, or digital wallets? The same question in the lower right-hand corner for alternative credentials overall, badges, micro-credentials. And look at the stark difference. You don't have to start looking at the percentages to see the differences in color. See the reds. The reds indicate that they either don't know anything about it or that they know about it and really don't care about it. So if you look at CLR and LER, you can see that that's quite a bit. It's kind of amazing. This is just an anecdote, but the comprehensive learner record is the province of AACRAO, and it really is born and bred. Even the name comes out of AACRAO, and yet for the membership, CLRs and lesser known LERs really are not at the forefront of everyone's familiarity, and I think that's pretty striking. On the other hand, take a look at the bottom, and you can see that, man, 61% are either considering or adopting alternative credentials in some sort. That is an adoption rate that has gained traction. And again, I'm repeating what I said on the previous slide. But I won't say that it's inevitable or that it's permanent, but it is happening, and it's going to get bigger. And I think I'm going to echo what Brenda said on the previous slide. If we don't deal with it as record professionals and get out in front of it, or at least become familiar with all the terms, concepts, responsibilities, and the kinds of actions that may become our responsibility, we're going to be hurting for certain. And so I think this is a very important slide for that. And the distinction between CLR, LER, and the whole idea of badges and alternative credentials. Brenda?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I know one of the other discussions that folks have is will this stick? Is this in demand? Why should I be spending my time and effort on it? But I think Mark made the point is that it's going to happen no matter what. And so, some of you may be seeing this on your campus, and whether or not it sticks, we have to be ready and deal with it at this time because it's here.
Right, and I think, and I'm going to say it real quickly, I don't want to get too far down the road here, but a comprehensive learner record really is about higher education and an academic record, as well as co-curricular or experiential activities that have been supervised and governed and considered by the institution of value. And those things are put together into a CLR. And I don't want to get too far into it, but an LER, our learner and employment record, is the same thing, but the issuer may be in the labor market. They may be skills and competencies that the individual learner has earned or learned on the job or via a certification. And when you put them all together, a CLR is a subcomponent of an LER.
Yeah.
The other point, one more thing about those two things is that they're verified. These things are issued by an authoritative institution, like an institution of higher education.
And I was just going to say, I think that part of my hypothesis, and we'll see if AACRAO decides to investigate any of this, setting up a CLR or an LER takes a lot more effort and organization, whereas, as I noted before, it's easy to start adopting a digital credential and issuing it. Now, whether or not that meets your institutional standards or if you're doing it for a subset of your organization. So I think a little bit of what's behind the difference in adoption rate is one takes a lot more coordination and effort to really put together in a thoughtful way, whereas you can begin to offer digital credentials rather quickly without that much effort. And so I think that's why we're seeing quicker adoption. I do think the two are still very connected.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I was just going to say, because the digital credentials feed into what many people will be expressed then on the comprehensive learner record or in the LER. Will be some of those credentials, especially the point that the verifiable ones, and then to have the distinction between what's verified and what isn't will be important.
And the other point I'd make about a CLR, LER too, but CLR is not mutually exclusive from badges and micro-credentials. As a matter of fact, badges and micro-credentials can all be contained within a CLR and be expressed as an association. In other words, one can be the child of another. You may need 3 or 4 badges in order to receive another award, maybe 3 or 4 experiences in order to receive another award in exactly the same way, in exactly a parallel construct to courses and a degree or courses and a certificate. So a transcript in a lot of ways is the CLR. A degree is the badge that lives in the transcript. And the supporting mechanisms, the associations, are that those courses support, as well as other things, support and are associated or children of that degree. So that's the connection. And Brenda is absolutely right. If you're going to build all of those associations, if they all have a hierarchical relationship with one another, it takes more administration. Anything else on that, Brenda?
No, I think you covered that. Hopefully.
And then learning mobility. Man, we were pleasantly surprised about this. Learning mobility, as opposed to learner mobility, which is again a nuanced difference, but an important one to think about. Learner mobility, I think, is pretty obvious. Learning mobility is the ability to take skills, competencies, learning outcomes, and express them on behalf of the individual and have them be communicated to multiple different spaces, whether that be higher education to higher education, whether that be higher education to a labor market, higher education to professional certifications. All of those things are places and pathways in which learning can be verified and expressed and accepted somewhere else. The beauty of this is that 83%, really a big number, said that their institutions found value in learning mobility. Now, I will admit, and it's worth saying, that I'm not sure that this nuanced difference between learning and learner was in their minds as they filled this out, but nevertheless, it is a nuanced difference. The idea that you really want to enable the student to carry what they've learned and their set of credentials with them as they travel forward in their career, that's exactly what we want. And it's apparently at 83% of the institutions, that's exactly what they want. Brenda.
Well, I was going to say, and Mark and I had a discussion about this yesterday, that I think this is one of the more confusing terms, and may have been confusing to some participating. We talk a lot about learner mobility and transfer, and we know that our learners transfer a lot, and that's a particular challenge in our in higher education today. The learning mobility is closely aligned, and there's been some questions about how you connect the two, and that's certainly a question that we may have to work on figuring out. You know, if I'm partway through a credential at one institution, but because these things don't work in the same way that credit hours work, you know, is that portable, or is it learning mobility only when it's completed? And then how do I take and express that? But I think that we do know, and that's sort of the point of these types of credentials, is that they are smaller, more flexible, modular, personal pathways, can be added together to bring up information that maybe, you know, would take a lot of time to go through a curriculum committee, but has some important value in terms of actual learning outcomes, that then can be taken somewhere else, expressed somewhere else, provide some of that learner velocity that we're all looking for to try and ensure that a student stays engaged with your institution. So, but it's a term that's not very commonly thought about, and I think the nuances get confused very easily.
I agree. You know, really, and the second bullet point on this slide really wasn't on the survey. It really is some of the distinctive characteristics of learning mobility, and the value of sort of expressing them in various ways, such as alternative credentials. So of those who really are participating, or even if they're not, even if they're just considering issuing alternative credentials, digital credentials in some form, what was the ROI? What was the rationale for pursuing such an initiative? And as you can see, it's pretty clear on your screen, really the first two pieces, all about students, all about learners. A good thing, right? You want to empower them. Really what that means is really in twofold. One is you want them to be able to articulate the kind of learning that they have received, that they have embodied in what they have learned, and be able to express that to somebody else. That's one level. The other level is we've given them a credential, placed it in their hands, and now they can express it in a verifiable way, not a self-assertion like saying I'm Brad Pitt. They can do it in a verifiable way to a third party, a potential employer, or to another institution in order to pursue higher levels of academic success. So those are the first two. You know, the next one is a good one. I mean, that's pure ROI, return on investment, competitive differentiation. Why are we doing it? We need to attract students. And how are we going to attract students? We're going to basically engage them and offer credentials for the kinds of things that they've learned, and enable those credentials to be verifiable and shareable across multiple business spaces. So, you know, that's a good one. And amazingly, I thought this particular piece was much higher than I thought it would be. I will also say that, and we haven't done this cross-sectional analysis yet, my hypothesis would be that this is really true more at the community college level than it is at the four-year degree granting school level. I can't say that for a fact. That's a hypothesis. But nevertheless, we're going to take a look and see if there is some correlational value in those two things. So, and last but not least, labor market participation. Absolutely true. What are we doing it? We're trying to basically enable our learners to be competitive in the labor market and to advance their careers. So being able to do that, there's also in serve the community. Particularly one of the missions of a community college is to serve the community, and that's one way in which they can actually do that. So interestingly enough, though, of those who were doing it, it was still only about half, a little over half, who found that these were the benefits to be derived from pursuing such an initiative. It's great. It is what we thought. It's also a little lower than we thought, and maybe it's something that we need to study a little bit more.
Yeah, I'd say that's one of the things that I hear a lot about is, will employers really use this? You know, the more information you give them, does that necessarily help? Or does this help them sort out the skill sets that they're actually looking for, that the learning outcomes match up? And it's still new enough that a lot of employers are not familiar with it. Institutions are still sort of struggling with it. And so I think the labor market participation might be somewhat aspirational, but we think that it will help, and that there have been some where it has helped. We know some boot camps and things like that have been offered, not always necessarily by our institutions, but sometimes by our institutions, have gotten some traction. But then there's some question about how do you manage, and what will be the perception with additional information for the labor market in other areas. And that kind of goes to your last summary point about the ROI. That's a discussion, because it isn't free. It does take time from staff and faculty if you're going to deliver a quality credential, as to how you plan that, how you market that, how you deliver that, and that those learning outcomes that you're standing behind and putting your institutional verification on are really worth something. And so, you know, is it worth that time that's invested? And right now we don't even know for sure what time investment it's going to take.
Yeah. Well said. Absolutely well said. Yeah. Do we have a question?
No.
You know, the other thing to point out here is, again, the differences between the responses if LER, CLR, and wallets were brought into the mix. It was just another level higher. In other words, of higher in the sense that, let me explain that. They have fewer perceived benefits. So the number of people who saw fewer perceived benefits for CLR and LER, easy for all of you guys to say, was it was more stark. So interestingly enough, one of the things that I wanted to say while Brenda was speaking is that we aren't doing this in a vacuum. We really are the supplier side. We issue credentials. We take them in terms of transfer, but a lot of these ROI questions really are about the employment side of the house, the labor market. And there are groups, SHRM is one, the United States Chamber of Commerce is another. There are plenty of parties interested in this. As a matter of fact, the United States Chamber of Commerce, the T3 Innovation Network, just did a great big conference on how the labor market could use such a skills-based hiring ecosystem. So moving on, so there's these next three slides are all related, and it really is questions about who the stakeholders are, and do they have a use case interest in digital credentials of all sorts. These in this case is not sorted out by whether it's CLR, LER, and alternative and badges or not. So in other words, when they saw these groups, they basically put none. They have no interest in these digital credentials, and it's somewhat shocking. I will say that. So 25% of the respondents said that the registrar have no role nor use case in digital credentials, and that's a shocking outcome. Earlier we talked about how at least 64% of all believe that the registrar should be involved. Here's 25% who think they're not even a use case before we even consider it. I think that's an important outcome. And it's all about culture. It's all about the individual environment. Maybe there's not an initiative of this type at that particular campus. They don't see it in the future. Perfectly possible. But just to see it outright and say that, for example, if we're going to be involved in the issuance of digital credentials, even recognition type digital badges, you'd have to think IT would have to be involved somehow. You would think that some of these other parties would also be involved. How did it hit you, Brenda?
Well, one of the things that jumped out to me was the low percentage on registrars, but I think that goes back to folks saying, is this something that our institution is asking for? My role will be when it becomes real, when I can see a demand for it. So there may be this, registrars should not lead the pack. They should not go out. And so there may be some of that kind of thought to it. The other thing that struck me, definitely the technology surprised me, because even though there are some credentials available that you can start issuing with relatively little help from technology, I'll tell you, if you want to keep track of those or do them in any decent way, you're going to need to talk with your technology folks. The institutional research, my hypothesis is that that's at that percentage that's uninvolved now because nobody's asked us to measure them. But you just mentioned, Mark, as soon as HLC gets interested, as soon as IPEDS gets interested, as soon as US News and World Report starts asking, how many of these are you issuing? That number will change very drastically. But right now, I think that they say, that's not on the list of things I'm supposed to measure and sort through. And so I don't see that. The one that really surprised me was learners. That 14%. Now that's a low percentage, as you said, then there's a much larger percent who sees that as being the learners. But that would be interesting to disaggregate that information and see, is that based upon the institutions? You commented earlier that certain types of institutions may find that their learners have a lot more demand for a digital credential. And then there may be some institutions that say, by the very nature of our institution and the kind of learning we deliver, this isn't going to be something our learners are looking for, or we don't think our learners would be looking for.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting one too. This would be another one that we ought to break down by institutional type.
Yes, for sure.
So on the other hand, if you did find that there was a use case, so here is the use case for alternative credentials, badges, micro-credentials. And I put the arrow out here just to show where the Office of the Registrar falls. It's a pretty good spot. Interestingly, kind of the reverse of what happened on the previous slide. Learners are right up there near the top. Professional continuing education, actually, the alignment, the common sense there, that makes a lot of sense. And then employers, career services, actually this aligns with what your hypothesis would be, what your expectations are. Just to contrast that a little bit, and then I'll ask for comments from Brenda. Here's the other side of that coin. Look what happens if you discuss CLR, digital wallet, and an LER. All of a sudden, those things change completely. So rather than seeing badges, credentials expressed in a digital form in various ways down a continuum, there's a stark difference in how they're seen by the respondents, and therefore what role the individual offices play or use they'll have for the expression of these credentials. So found that pretty interesting. You can see, just to do this, you can see how the office of the registrar changes. It's also true of other units there too, but you get the idea.
And I think, Mark, this may go back to how institutions are defining their digital credentials. At our institution, we do have a policy that faculty council passed, but it's a very broad policy intentionally, and it covers the breadth of those that may be issued for more of an experience, all the way up to a credential that has some pretty steep learning outcomes that take a lot to earn. And so I think that in some cases, folks are saying, well, the registrar's office is not that important if these are things that are just sort of floating out there, and maybe faculty are issuing even on their own right now. But as soon as you start collecting them into something that is close to credit, or that stacks together and becomes a full record, then that's a different kind of a thing. And so I think that might be part of the reason, but I'm not really sure, and I'm sure some of the folks participating may have some ideas, but I think that's a little bit of a drop, but I could be wrong.
Right. I will also say, just as a sidebar, these are, every group on here is a group that basically AACRAO and you in the office of the registrar, if you have an initiative like this going on campus, here are the groups you have to pay attention to.
Mhm.
Really is sort of an outline right there of who should participate.
Well, and I'd like to call special attention to professional continuing education. Depending on how your organization is set up, your institution, in some cases, they're integrally involved with the campus and related to expressions of credit or those kind of things. If you are at an institution where that is a sort of a separate universe, you maybe haven't even thought about talking to your professional and continuing ed folks, or you may see that all of this is really their issue and not necessarily the more traditional campus or registrar's role, or even admissions being concerned about. I think admissions ranks a little bit higher as we were thinking more about holistic evaluation of our applicants, and then also about that note that you made earlier, Mark, about that competitive edge. What do we have to offer? This is something we can offer. But I think that sometimes registrar's offices may not always think about the professional continuing education folks either as partners or maybe even engage with them that often, just depending on how your organization is set up.
Right. And the last thing I'd add is, what registrars bring to this overall process is we are the record professionals. We really are. And if this is something that is an initiative of the institution and the institution wants to stand behind, they absolutely, positively need record professionals to manage it.
Yeah.
That's an opinion.
Yeah.
And I was a former registrar, so it's probably not an objective opinion, but it's certainly one that I think that needs to be expressed.
Well, and I jump in there and say that yes, and from enrollment management standpoint as well, you want to be able to track these and know that they are real entities. And I would just throw out the hypothesis that there's probably a number of folks on here, if you work at a registrar's office, where you have encountered certificates that have been issued off the desktop of some entity on your campus, and the recipient believes that it's a real record, and then they've come back to you some years later and asked for some kind of verification or another copy of it, only to find that that was not actually an approved credential. And that's always a challenge. I've talked to many people about this and how their institution handles it. And so I see the digital version of that just being the same song in another verse.
Is it part of this system of record? Question. This next question is all about challenges and concerns around an implementation. And what I need to express here is this was a free-form kind of comment. So what we did here is take a look at those free-form comments, basically categorize them, and once we categorize them, to basically do a frequency distribution and came up with these. So these are somewhat in order. You know, taking a look at these, it's really not surprising, but the first two, it's really all about resources and institutional priority, right? I work again. I worked in an office for 40 years. So there were times when I felt that we had all of the resources at our disposal performing at an optimal stage and just barely treading water, trying to keep operations moving. And so then when someone comes along with another initiative like this that obviously needs records professionals, it is something we have to address. Absolutely something we have to address. Whether it's on the resource side, whether it's a financial consideration, whether it's institutional priority for doing the development work that's required in order to support it. All of those things are resource requirements that have to be managed and administered. So we completely get this, and we'll talk more about it when we talk about some of the things that we think we can add. Because one of the questions we ask later is, what can AACRAO do? How can we help? So we'll get to some of that. Communication and adoption. That's really all about campus culture, whether or not how communication works. You know, how siloed you are as a campus. Whether or not there really is some alignment going on between the organizations. All of those things were discussed in there. Accreditation and uniformity. I'll also talk about number 6, quality evaluation and governance. This was all about how do we express these things in a meaningful and verifiable and with integrity. All of these things talk about that. How do we manage governance? Where's the evaluation occurring? What is the quality of the credential that's being expressed? Is accreditation going to matter? Yeah, I'm just repeating it, so you get the idea. And also the kinds of things that I think we as records professionals care about: privacy and security. Absolutely. That's what we do. Compliance is what we do. So all of those things are there. And then if you look at 7 and 9, that goes back to speaking to ROI. Why should we do it? Is it worth the investment? And so on. And even the recipients of this work, the learner and the employer or the recipient of the credential itself, do they find it valuable? So all of those things, very, very good questions.
The only thing I'd add, Mark, is I think it also reflects the order that you need to think of this in. You need to be able to have it set up before you go out and communicate about it. You need to make sure you have your accreditation and uniformity and your governance before you can explain to the student and employer the perceived value. So those things to me sort of also reflect the order in which you need to have your acts together.
So, and I'm going to go through this one relatively quickly. You know, we're really talking about interoperability. Where can these things work? This was, again, a semi-open-ended question. So if you, and one of the things I said at the very beginning, you know, I think people realize the expression of these kinds of digital credentials. Less mature is the idea of how they travel across different spaces. How interoperable are they? Onto what platforms can they be used and ingested in other places? But obviously, if you look at optimistic, number 1, well, of course, LinkedIn. Here's a digital credential that says that I can do critical thinking. And actually, after this webinar, you may not think I can. Nevertheless, I may have a badge that expresses that I can, and I can put that on someplace like LinkedIn. But more importantly, what about job search platforms, HR systems, other kinds of digital wallets? So that's the kind of interoperability there. Where there was some skepticism expressed, it was really about feasibility. Can we really come up with standards? What about data privacy and security? Will that be a challenge that just ends this kind of forward momentum? Is there really any demand for this stuff? So, and therefore, should we even go over the top and try and get over the challenge of interoperability? So those were the kinds of things that were expressed there.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. I think you said it.
And last, or well, not last, but Office of Registrar involvement. Again, we talked about this. And 64% think they are. Another way of saying that is basically 2/3 believe that we should. And here are all the reasons why, and what I threw up are some of the comments. This was another free-form question. Interestingly enough, what about the other third? So although 64% is a big number, and actually we're kind of pleasantly surprised with that number, man, it's just not big enough. And actually in October, it's October and November, stay tuned. We're really going to try and address this issue. What is the registrar's involvement? What kinds of things do we need to concern ourselves with? How do we basically engage with the rest of the campus in order to be a key player and contributor to the initiatives in place? Brenda?
Yeah, I think we've kind of covered that, and like you said, we'll have another webinar coming up.
So here's an interesting one. Here's alternative credentials and the impact on revenue. So the idea here is basically there are two principal sources of revenue that we're directly involved in. The first one is usually transcripts. It's not true everywhere, but it's true at a number of institutions. It certainly was true of mine. And degree certification is another income or revenue source. So if we introduce this whole new set of digital credentials, what impact did respondents see on that revenue stream? And you can see 30% saw potential for a decrease in revenue, 44% saw an increase in revenue. The important thing, though, and we did not introduce this as a concept or thoughts of how this might happen, but the whole idea of self-sovereignty, student self-sovereignty over their credentials. In other words, learners having agency over their credentials. They receive it once. The credential itself is self-verifiable. It's trusted. It does not need to emanate from the issuer in order to be trusted and reviewed by a third party. If that happens, what happens to the revenue stream? You know, to a certain extent, and a number of institutions, they do this already with their transcript. A PDF transcript can be set up to do exactly this. You know, the phrase, every copy is an original. You know, that I don't mean that in a professional manner, but in a popular notion. In other words, you get a copy, it has a digital signature, it has encryption, and when it opens on the network, it says, I am valid, I have not been tampered with. And if you give it to you once, I can copy it and send it out to multiple parties. Well, again, if you do this, and you do this for all kinds of credentials, what impact might that have on our existing revenue streams? In other words, what happens to degree certification if I don't need to go to a third party in order to verify that this is a valid assertion, right? What do I do? So what are we going to do about that? I'm not sure everyone recognized that as a potential impact. This is worthy of further investigation. You know, it's still a hypothesis for us at this point. We can't put a hammer, we can't put our imprimatur on that as an absolute, but we really do believe that it'll have an impact on existing revenue streams. And we need to find and research it more thoroughly and perhaps develop other models that will substitute the revenue stream that might be lost as a result of movement in this direction.
For sure.
So last but not least, what kind of additional information was needed? This was, again, a free-form question. We analyzed it in much the same way I talked about that before. And again, what comes up? Clear definitions. What do we mean? What's the difference between those two things? And once we get those definitions, then we can start to understand the mechanics of how to support each and every one and how they interact and align and coincide with one another. Until we have that, man, it's tough. So I think that was first and foremost. We really did derive that out of the survey. Second, man, we need best practices. I specifically chose not to use those words, but you need to know how other people did it. What was the framework? What were the guidelines? What sets of policies guided the work? How did the practices support those policies? That's all one side. Where were these stored? In what systems? Did we need to create 2 new tables? How were they integrated with one another? How were they asserted? Onto what platform? All of these questions, we need those out there. And not that there is just one best practice, but we need a resource that enables us to do to find those that are practical in your situation and culture. So those are the kinds of things that we basically got out of this. Benchmarks of practice, in other words, how do you, if here is one, what becomes the baseline and what becomes a value add above that baseline? Benchmarking kind of work. More work on return on investment, how to implement guides, more than just guidelines, more than just best practices, but how to go about starting to implement these things and truly understand the costs. That's a big thing. What is my resource expenditure in order to make this happen? Make it happen, development and implement on the one hand, and operate on the other. Well, you got to do both, and then you've got to let it mature over time. So how does that happen too? So all of these things need to happen. We recognize them. It was a clear message from the respondents. Anything to add, Brenda? I know
we're kind of running short on time. I think you've kind of covered that. So I know we want to clip on through, other than I do like some people are pointing out that we should stop pushing this. And so I just would say, we're trying to not push, but to provide support for those of you who are interested.
So what are we doing? Obviously, we need more clear definitions. I think we beat that up in this webinar. We think that alternative credentialing is gaining traction. It might be inevitable. And we're working to try and build an ecosystem in which each one isn't an artwork that each institution has to prepare. In fact, it's a little more standard. It fits into a little more routine, and it fits into a common shared service ecosystem that we all understand and can use. So that's what we're doing in these bullet points here. And actually, I do want to emphasize the very last bullet point on this slide. It's interesting, and this is one of my elevator speeches, but we have had a digital standard for the exchange of transcripts since 1989. And to date, only 17% of the institutions have fully engaged in that process. It's crazy to me. It is just crazy. But there are reasons for that. And there's a cost to engage, there's development costs, there's reasons, there's ROI, all of those things. Well, when it comes to credentials, why can't we treat them in the same way the cell phone industry can communicate, despite the fact that we have different cell phones, different technologies, different cell towers? They all make that work somehow. They still have differentiation that occurs on the vendor sides and on the phone sides, but they can exchange. One phone can talk to another. One's text can talk to another. The banking industry is the same thing. We need to create the middleware, the middle view that makes the exchange of these credentials possible. Registrar involvement, we already talked about that. However, we think this number, 64%, should be bigger. The challenges and concerns, we're going to develop some resources to deal with those. And I think I mentioned those as I went through them. And here's the clear thing. So what are we doing? Terms and definitions. we really are going to either find or do and perform some research on what the ROI is for these types of assertions, and surface them so that you can all see them and understand why some institutions have chosen to go this direction. Build both research and referential repositories so people have a place to turn to find practices, policies, and any other bits of information that may help them. We want to build some online courses. As a matter of fact, one should be coming out yet this fall as an introduction to alternative credentials. I already talked about benchmarking, and we need to do some research on business models and determine if this is really a concern and provide alternatives if it is. So that's it. 1 minute over.
Yeah, and I think Paige has something to throw in.
Yes, so hopefully you all found this engaging and interesting, and I'm assuming by signing on to this that you're interested in this topic. So we do have an online community forum called the AACRAO Exchange, and we have a group there dedicated to digital credentials that we would love for you to join. You can ask questions there if you have any about that, and we'll also post about upcoming webinars and different things like that. So we share resources and other things, and we would love to see that. It's something we're growing, and we would love to hear from you there. And I put the link in the chat to our website that kind of talks about our digital credentials page, and there's a button on there that says join, and so you should be able to go in there, and you can reach out to exchange@acrao.org if you have any issues.
By the way, it's worth pointing out that if you notice that both Brenda and Paige share a last name, they are in fact related.
Just a little bit.
Well, let me just say thanks to everybody. Even thanks for going over time a little bit. Thanks to Paige. Thanks to Brenda, thanks to Mike Simmons, thanks to Noah and Wendy for putting together the analysis, and thanks for spending an afternoon with us.
Thank you.